One of the most grateful times of my life was when my son Polani was applying to colleges. He had done so well academically and in other ways in his life, and when he was 17, he started thinking about what colleges he wanted to really go to, and he was going big. There were people that said, "You're going to apply at Stanford? Most people don't get in. That's like the hardest school to get into. And by the way, your dad doesn't make very much money as a pastor. He'll never be able to afford to help you out." And, there was definitely some negative voices. Some of those vibrations weren't quite what Kathleen was just talking about. But, I just said to Polani, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go to college? What would bring you great joy? And so, he applied to Stanford. He applied to some other great schools, but I'll never forget that day when he got his letter from Stanford, and I had to read it 3 times. He said, "Dad, the letter just arrived. Can you read it with me?" He was a little nervous, and I almost was speechless. I was just overflowing with gratitude. He got into his first choice university and ended up going to Stanford. And what totally blew me away was the next letter that I read from Stanford that said he was on a full scholarship. So I'll just tell you, when it comes to gratitude, there's not a whole lot in my life that beats that moment. I was just so thrilled. And as I was thinking this week about how gratitude spreads, I was amazed at how every single person I talked to, it was like they experienced my gratitude with me. It wasn't like, "Oh, well, let's just be happy for Alan." I mean, I remember calling my mom, my sister, my brothers, my best friends. They almost all literally screamed with joy and gratitude. And I just thought, wow, that's amazing. That week, I was I was shopping, and I ran into a friend that I knew in high school, and I think I maybe saw her twice in 30 years, once at her wedding and another time after I had moved back to California after living in several places where I served churches. And she saw me, her name's Leslie, and she said, "Alan, how are you doing?" And I just found out Polani got accepted to Stanford, and I was like, "I'm doing really well. Polani just got into Stanford on a full scholarship." And she just like literally squealed. I mean, it was like, "I'm so happy for you. This is wonderful." And she was just like glowing as if she literally was sharing my joy and gratitude. What truly blew me away, though, there was a lady standing just on the other side of her, total stranger to both of us, that was eavesdropping on this conversation. And she looked over and just beaming with joy said, "Congratulations, well done." And I thought, I don't know this woman at all. I didn't know if she was a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist. I didn't know if she was born in our country or an immigrant. I didn't know if she was a Democrat or Republican. I didn't know anything about her. But there was something about great joy and gratitude that just kind of dissolves all the differences that we often think are so very important. Of course, there's always got to be one. So Polani came home from school the day after the letters came, and he said, "Dad, I got scolded today by one of my friends." And I said, "Oh yeah, what happened?" He said, "Well, this one girl who I know pretty well, she said, 'Polani, how dare you start telling everybody you got accepted into Stanford? You know you're not the only one that applied and nobody else got in. You're the only one.'" And she told him that he was actually being really rude and selfish by talking about it. So I just said, "Well, Polani, imagine what the alternative would be. Like, you walk into your class and someone said, 'Oh my gosh, Polani, you're like glowing. Why are you so happy?' 'Well, I can't really talk about it because it might hurt somebody's feeling that's not having a good day.'" I just thought, no, it's like when you're overflowing with gratitude and joy, you just naturally do it. So anyway, we had a little conversation, and I said, I think the people that tried to get into Stanford and didn't, if they had a good shot at it, they're going to get into a really good school, and I'm pretty sure you're going to be really joyful for them when they share their good news with you, right? And he said, "Yeah, of course." And I said, "Well, I think gratitude and joy is meant to be shared. So go ahead and share it. Don't rub it in somebody's face, or if somebody's having a hard time with it, let it be. but there's something about gratitude that you're just supposed to share. Now, one of the things that I read in Diana Butler Bass's book, Grateful, is what social psychologists have studied and learned about gratitude. Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, said that if you put monitors on people and you check their heart rate and their breathing and so on and so forth, simply by observing a person being grateful, your heart rate just starts to lower. You become calm. It's like you go into this deep, grateful, meditative phase, and your breathing is more calm and natural. And as opposed to fear or anger or anxiety, when your heart starts beating faster and you're not breathing very well, even looking at somebody that you don't know experiencing gratitude has this calming effect and a relational effect as well. Diana talks about how when you simply watch somebody else being grateful, you feel connected to them most of the time, at least if you are open. She also talks about this kind of gratitude that's not real gratitude, that's exclusive. And she talks about in our country when patriotism turns into nationalism, we have a problem. Gratitude is to be shared all over the place. And when you say, these gifts are for me and people like me only, that's not true gratitude. Anyway, Diana talks about this wonderful thing that happens not only in our minds and in our hearts, but in our bodies. When we feel grateful and we simply watch somebody else being grateful and expressing that, and we're open to that in love. And she talks a lot about the importance of true gratitude and love going together. So in this morning's scripture lessons, there's some really good advice, I think, for all of us regarding gratitude. And they both happen to do with offering, what we offer or sacrifice to God. And in Psalm 50, the idea is that when you come to God with your offering, whatever that may happen to be, you ought to come with gratitude. And so the psalmist in Psalm 50 takes on the role of the prophet and speaks on behalf of God. And basically said, I'm God. It's just to make it clear that it's God speaking. And God basically says, all these gifts that people are bringing to me, I don't have a problem with the gifts. What I have, though, a problem with is what's missing. And what was missing was gratitude. And we all know that you can give gifts for many reasons that have nothing to do with love. And the first thing that comes to my mind is the gift of obligation. It's kind of like, imagine this, and some of you, I'm sure, have experienced this or something like it before. You're at the office Christmas party, and you draw somebody's name, and you can't stand that person, and you have to get them a nice gift for $20. And you're like, oh, God, why this person? But you know what? You do it anyway because you're obligated. Well, people were bringing gifts to God in that way. When the psalmist was writing Psalm 50, and God was basically saying, I own all this stuff anyway. You could bring me everything, but I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I own all the wild animals in the forest. It's all mine in the first place. What I really want from you more than anything else is gratitude. And then in Mark 12, I'm just going to tell you right up front, Mark 12 is one of my favorite chapters in all of the Bible. And I'm going to explain that in just a moment. But in Mark 12, we have a couple of significant players with Jesus, and one of them happens to be a scribe, and the other one happens to be a poor widow. But like most of the Bible, I would say 99% of it, we really do need to look at the context, because we can pull scriptures out of wherever we want and try to make them sound like they back up whatever ideas we happen to be in favor of. But anyway, in Mark 12, you have to get the picture of what was going on in order to understand the true messages of the particulars. And so in Mark 12, you've got all the key players in society there in the temple in Jerusalem, not too far from it was called a box, I believe, but basically the offering place where the rich and powerful and wealthy would put on all these fancy clothes and kind of wave their $100 or $1,000 bills around, make sure everybody sees them, put it in, and ta-da! And Jesus is giving his little lesson while people are basically showing off how much money they're putting in and what good people they are. You also have this poor widow, and she has 2 coins, and I looked this up. They amounted to about a penny together. So like these 2 half pennies, that's all she owned. And she put her 2 half pennies basically in the offering bowl after these really rich and fancy clothed people were putting in their hundreds and thousands and so on and so forth. But to truly understand what's going on, here are the people that were actually there as Jesus was talking about gratitude and love. You had the Sadducees, and they were a group of people, kind of like a very special elite club that believed that it's really, really, really important in life to follow everything in the Jewish law. In other words, if you looked at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, follow every single thing that's in there, and that's what we do, and that's what makes us so special as Sadducees. You also had the Pharisees, who was another group of people, very influential, like the Sadducees, but they believed not only are you supposed to follow every single thing that's in the Jewish law, but the Pharisees also believe there's all these other things that you have to abide by, and we as Pharisees do every single one of them. Aren't we special? Now, before I go on, I'll just say the Pharisees and Sadducees hated each other. And I would say it's similar to what we might see in Washington, D.C. right now with very staunch Republicans and very staunch Democrats. They, in no way, shape, or form, got along. Now, I'm going to explain this a little bit more. The Pharisees believed in an afterlife, and the Sadducees didn't. You see, this idea of heaven and an afterlife developed in Jewish culture and history and theology over time. We have heard about heaven all these years. We just assume that that was always a part of Jewish culture, but for many, many years, they never really talked about an afterlife. And then, I think it was within a few hundred years before Jesus, people came along and started talking about the importance of focusing on what we do now so that we can have a good afterlife when we die. Well, the Sadducees, I would say, were kind of the more conservative ones in that point, saying, this new stuff about an afterlife, we're just not buying it. Well, the Pharisees and Sadducees, can you imagine? There is an afterlife, there's no afterlife, and on and on. And so one was, in general, more conservative, and the other one much more liberal. But, you know, the idea was they didn't like each other, but they were the movers and shakers in their society. They're the ones that were the major decision makers. They controlled most of the wealth, the power, and they were very prestigious. So you had the Sadducees, you had the Pharisees, and then you had the scribes. And this was the well-educated class of people that also had a lot of money. And by the way, you could be a scribe and a Pharisee, or a scribe and a Sadducee as well. But the best way I could think of to describe what it was like in that day to be a scribe, it's kind of like a combination of an attorney and a theologian all wrapped up together. So they had a lot of clout. Now, these people were the prestigious ones with a lot of money and a lot of power. But in this story, this next group isn't mentioned very often in the scriptures. In fact, I can't think off the top of my head a single other place that they are mentioned. But they're called the Herodians. This is the family and entourage of King Herod. They were even there. Now, these were the people that were related to the king, and if you think the Sadducees and Pharisees and the scribes had a lot of power and clout and wealth and prestige, the Herodians were there as well. So imagine all these people putting in their very, very, very large offerings into the box of sacrifice. Jesus is watching all this as he's teaching, and then this lady, who is, first of all, a lady. And in those days, the men controlled everything. The ladies weren't even allowed any further into the temple. I mean, they could go where they could make their offering, but to go where the decisions are made or where the blessings actually happened or the real sacrifices, the women couldn't even go in there. So one strike against her in that culture, she was a woman. Number two, she was a widow. She didn't even have a man in her life. Imagine that. In that society, that was about as bad as things could get. But every once in a while, there was a wealthy widow, but not this one. She had everything going against her in the eyes and in the minds of that particular society. She had nothing. People would look at this woman and think how pitiful, how distraught. She has absolutely nothing going for her. They would look at her and want to look the other way. That's how bad they would feel about this person. And yet, she owned 2 half pennies. And she put her 2 half pennies in the offering. And Jesus watched and said, what she just put in is more than all of the rest of what you guys just put in altogether. Now, you probably can figure this out on your own, but they didn't like Jesus very much. Because Jesus looked at what they did and who they were being and said, that's not what God has called us to do. You trample on widows. You don't love. In fact, the whole point of the story of Jesus and the scribe is when the scribe said, what is the most important commandment? And Jesus actually had to love God with all your being, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is the most important thing. And so the message is, as people are dropping things off in the offering plate, Jesus is basically saying, what you put in, the amount that you put in is not important to me and it's not important to God. It's the love and the gratitude that goes along with the gift. Now, I'm just going to be very frank with you. Every year, when it comes time for people to fill out their commitment cards, almost every year anyway, somebody comes to me and tells me they feel bad because they don't have enough to put in. And I often tell them about the story of this widow. 2 copper coins. But because she put in to the offering love and gratitude, that was worth more than everything else combined because it was missing those 2 things. And so what I do is I share with people, whatever it is that you give to the church or to your favorite nonprofit or whatever, the important thing is that you give with love and gratitude. And God is thrilled. And I'll just tell you, I, as your pastor, am thrilled as well. Because I can't think of anything better than for people to come to church with all the love and gratitude in their hearts and say, here I am. The other thing I want to point out, there's just a couple of implications, I think, for us living in the 21st century. I just mentioned that one, come with love and gratitude to church and in all your gifts here at church. The second thing is, Jesus is pointing out, and the psalmist is pointing out, that what you do in church should also relate to what you do out there. You don't just come with your love and your gratitude when you come to church and check it at the door when you go out into the world or when you go home or when you go to work or school or whatever. The psalmist said, God said, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. What I want more than anything is your gratitude. And the idea here is everything that you have. Your life, your money, your talents, your treasures, your breath, everything belongs to God. Doesn't matter if you're in church or you're anywhere else. You can worship God by giving gratitude and love every single moment of the day. And wouldn't that be nice if we left this worship service and went on worshiping 24/7 by bringing love and gratitude, and I hope a whole lot of joy to whatever it is that we offer to God throughout the week.